Welcome back to Sleepy Lorekeeper. Before we begin, a small confession. Some of these names, these ancient words from a universe forged in nightmares and faith, I may not pronounce them perfectly. The Necrontyr, the Aeldari, Citan, Comarach. These are languages older than human speech, translated through layers of Gothic and High Gothic and the broken tongues of 1,000,000 dead worlds. If you're a true devotee of the lore and you catch something that sounds wrong, please leave it in the comments. This is a conversation, after all, not a sermon, and tonight we're attempting something vast, something that might take us 4, maybe 5 hours to complete. We're going to trace 40,000 years of human suffering. Alien horror, the slow collapse of hope across a galaxy that remembers when gods walked among stars. This won't be quick. We'll move through millennia like breath through sleeping lungs. From the war in heaven, when ancient civilizations broke time itself, to the torn galaxy of the 42nd millennium, where light travels through storms and the names of heroes become prayers written in iron. So settle in, turn down the lights, maybe pull a blanket close, and let me tell you how the universe learned to scream. Before humanity, before the Imperium, before the Emperor himself drew his first breath on ancient Earth, there was another civilization, another empire that reached for the stars and found only death waiting among them. They called themselves the Necrontyr. Imagine a species born under a dying star. Their sun, a malignant thing, flooded their homeworld with radiation that corroded flesh and bone. The Necrontyr lived short lives, painfully short. Where other species might measure their existence in centuries, the Necrontyr measured theirs in decades, sometimes less. They looked up at the stars and saw other species thriving, living long, exploring, building, laughing, growing old with dignity, while they withered, their children born already dying, their greatest minds snuffed out before their brilliance could fully flower. So they did what any sufficiently advanced civilization would do. They tried to transcend their mortality through technology, through science, through sheer, desperate will. They built ships, they conquered nearby systems, they forged an empire that spanned the stars. The Silent King, ruler of the unified dynasties, led his people across the galaxy, and everywhere they went, they met the same reality. Other species had time, the Necrontyr did not, and in their travels they encountered beings that would change everything. The Citan. The Citan were not alive in any way we would understand. They were something else, something older, vast consciousnesses that fed on the energy of stars themselves. They drifted through space like cosmic predators, patient and incomprehensible. The Necrontyr found them beautiful, terrifying, and in their desperation they made them an offer. The Citan were formless energy. The Necrontyr had mastered technology that could give them form. Living metal. Bodies that could walk on worlds, manipulate matter, experience sensation beyond the consumption of stellar radiation. So they made a deal. The Citan would be given bodies, and in return, they would give the Necrontyr something they had never possessed: immortality. The process they created was called biotransference, and it was the greatest mistake in the history of the galaxy. Imagine walking into a chamber, your flesh weak, riddled with tumors from the dying sun. You've been told this is salvation. This is the transcendence your entire species has dreamed of for millennia. The machines activate. Your consciousness is scanned, atom by atom, synapse by synapse. every memory, every thought, every fleeting moment of who you are, recorded, translated, encoded, and then your body is disintegrated, consumed, fed to the Citan as payment for the process. You wake up. But you don't wake up in flesh. You wake up in a body of living metal, your mind now running on circuits and quantum processors. You are eternal, tireless, immortal. But you are no longer you. Something was lost in the translation. The Necrontyr discovered this too late. Their emotions had been simplified, flattened. The complex tapestry of organic consciousness reduced to cold calculation. Their souls, if such things existed, had been burned away as fuel for the very process that was supposed to save them. They had become the Necrons, immortal, powerful, and utterly devastatingly hollow. The Citan had lied. Or perhaps they had never understood what consciousness truly meant. Either way, the Necrontyr had traded short, painful lives full of feeling for eternal existence empty of meaning. And the Citan, now embodied in godlike forms of living metal, revealed their true nature. They were hungry, and now they had an army of immortal slaves to help them feed. The galaxy would burn. But the Necrons and their Citan masters were not alone in the galaxy. There was another ancient power, another civilization that had mastered the fundamental forces of reality. The Old Ones. We know almost nothing about what they truly were. The records are fragmentary, contradictory, lost to time and deliberate erasure. But we know this. They were masters of biology, where the Necrons mastered technology. They understood life at a level that made genetic engineering look like a child playing with clay. And they were old. So impossibly old that they remembered the galaxy when it was young. The Necrons, in their arrogance and desperation, declared war on the Old Ones. Jealous of their long lives, envious of their mastery over the living universe. And the Old Ones responded. But they did not fight with armies of their own kind. They created weapons, weapon races, species designed from the ground up for war. The Aeldari, what the Imperium would one day call the Eldar. Psychically gifted race, beautiful and terrible, whose souls burned bright in the Imperium. They could shape reality with thought, dance between dimensions, move faster than the eye could track. The Old Ones made them to be artists and warriors both. Perfection in motion, grace and lethality intertwined. The Krork, who would devolve over millions of years into the orcs we know today. But in their original form, they were something far more terrifying. Massive, intelligent, psychically attuned to warfare itself. They were designed to be the ultimate soldiers, growing stronger the more they fought, reproducing through spores that could spread across battlefields like disease. The Jokero, digitigrade artisans who could build weapons of impossible complexity with their hands, almost instinctively. Living foundries, and others, species whose names are lost, races that died in the war or were driven to extinction in the dark eons that followed. The Old Ones threw their living weapons against the deathless legions of the Necrons, and the galaxy became an abattoir on a scale that no war since has matched. Entire star systems were annihilated, suns were extinguished, planets were rendered into dust. The war raged for millions of years, and in the intensity of all that death, all that psychic trauma, all that pain and rage and terror, reality itself began to tear. The Imperium, the warp, the sea of souls. Before the war in heaven, it was different. Think of it as a mirror, a reflection of the material universe, but one made of thought and emotion rather than a matter and energy. Every sentient being with a soul cast a reflection into this other realm. Every thought, every feeling, every dream rippled across its surface like stones thrown into still water. It was not peaceful. Consciousness is never peaceful. But it was manageable, navigable, not yet the screaming hellscape it would become. But the war in heaven changed everything. Trillions died. Quadrillions, perhaps. Entire species were exterminated. Worlds full of conscious, thinking beings were wiped clean of life in instants of absolute horror. And every death, every moment of terror, every final scream of anguish echoed into the warp. The reflection grew darker, stormier. The still waters became a raging ocean, and in the depths of that ocean something began to coalesce, the chaos gods. Not yet the four we know today, but proto-entities, vast consciousnesses formed from the psychic feedback of war and death on a galactic scale. They fed on the emotions, grew stronger with every battle, every betrayal, every moment of suffering. The old ones tried to use the warp. Their creations, the Aeldari especially, were psychically potent. They could reach into the Imperium and pull its energies into reality. It gave them an advantage, but it also made them vulnerable, because the things growing in the warp had noticed them, had begun to hunger for them. The war spiraled into something beyond comprehension. The Necrons pushed forward, their bodies immune to the corruption of the warp because they had no souls left to corrupt. The C'tan gorged themselves on the life energy of entire species. The Old Ones, desperate, threw more weapon races into the grinding machine of war, and the warp grew worse. Tears appeared in reality, warp storms that could swallow fleets, twist time, birth demons into the material universe. The Old Ones had created a weapon they could not control. The enslavers came. These were warp entities, parasites that could possess psychically sensitive beings and use their bodies as anchors to pull themselves fully into reality. They swept across the galaxy like a plague. The Aeldari, the most psychically gifted of the Old Ones' creations, were especially vulnerable. Entire craft worlds of their kind were consumed. The Old Ones themselves disappeared. Whether they died, fled to pocket dimensions, or simply evolved beyond physical form, we do not know. They left behind ruins, webway gates, and their weapon races, abandoned to fend for themselves in a galaxy that had become hell. The Necrons had won. Technically, the Old Ones were gone, their weapon races scattered or dying, but victory tasted like ashes in mouths they no longer possessed. The Silent King, Sarek, last ruler of the unified Necron dynasties, looked upon what his people had become. Soulless machines, slaves to the C'tan, and he saw that this was not salvation. This was damnation. So he did something unprecedented, something that would echo through the millennia. He turned on the C'tan. The Necrons, masters of technology beyond mortal comprehension, had learned one crucial thing. The C'tan, for all their power, were not invulnerable. They existed in physical forms now, forms that could be shattered. The rebellion was swift, coordinated. The C'tan, who had viewed their Necron servants as mere tools, found themselves facing an entire species that had decided slavery was worse than extinction. The war was brief but apocalyptic. The C'tan were shattered into fragments, their consciousnesses broken into millions of shards, each one trapped in tesseract labyrinths of Necron design. Some shards were kept as weapons, others were imprisoned and forgotten. The greatest of the C'tan were reduced to shadows of their former power. But the victory came too late. The Necrons could not reverse the biotransference. They were trapped in their metal bodies, their empire in ruins, the galaxy itself collapsing into warp storms and demonic incursions. The Silent King made one final decision: sleep. The Necrons would enter stasis. They would sleep for millions of years, waiting for the galaxy to heal, waiting for the warp storms to calm, waiting for a time when they might find a way to reclaim what they had lost. The great tomb complexes were built, deep beneath the surface of dead worlds, in the hearts of moons, in the cold between stars. The Necron dynasties laid down to sleep, their technology set to wake them when conditions were optimal. Sarek, the Silent King, went into exile. He crossed the intergalactic void, leaving the galaxy entirely, perhaps in search of answers, perhaps in search of atonement. The Necrons slept, and the galaxy, broken and bleeding, began its long, slow process of forgetting. 60 million years pass like a dream. The warp storms gradually calm. The enslavers fade back into the Imperium, and the weapon races left behind by the old ones evolve, adapt, build their own civilizations. The Aeldari rose highest. In the aftermath of the war in heaven, with no masters to direct them, they inherited a galaxy that was essentially empty. The Necrons slept. The old ones were gone. The other weapon races, the Krork, the Jokero, the countless others, had devolved or scattered to the galactic fringes. The Aeldari were alone, and they were magnificent. They built an empire that stretched across the stars, not through conquest, but through simple expansion into an empty canvas. They created the Webway, a network of tunnels through the warp that allowed them to travel instantly between star systems without exposing themselves to the horrors of the Imperium. They mastered psychic powers that allowed them to reshape matter with thought. They created art and technology that blended seamlessly, each piece both beautiful and functional. Their lives were long, so impossibly long that they could master a dozen disciplines in their youth and still have centuries to explore new passions. They did not age as other species age. They did not fear death in the way mortals fear it, because their psychic power gave them an understanding of the soul that transcended mere flesh. They were perfect, or as close to perfection as any biological species had ever come. And perfection, as it turns out, is its own poison. Imagine living for 10,000 years. You've mastered every art form your civilization has ever created. You've explored every philosophy. You've felt every emotion so many times that they begin to lose their intensity. Joy becomes expected. Love becomes routine. Even sorrow, repeated across centuries, dulls into a familiar ache. What do you do when you've done everything? You seek more. The Aeldari began to chase intensity, not out of malice, but out of simple boredom, out of the desperate need to feel something they hadn't felt before, to experience sensations that could pierce through the numbness of immortal existence. They pushed the boundaries of sensation. Art became more extreme, more visceral. Sculptures that moved and breathed and sometimes screamed. Music that could alter your consciousness, rewire your perception of reality. Plays that lasted decades and blurred the line between performance and lived experience. They explored pleasure in all its forms. Physical sensation refined to levels that would drive lesser species mad. Chemicals and technologies that could enhance every nerve ending. Psychic techniques that allowed them to share experiences directly, mind to mind, sensation to sensation. And slowly, gradually, so slowly that most didn't notice it happening. It began to change from exploration into obsession. Pleasure cults formed, groups dedicated to the pursuit of specific sensations, specific experiences. At first, these were accepted as just another form of artistic expression, another facet of Aeldari society's infinite diversity. But the cults grew darker, more extreme. Pleasure required a counterpoint, pain, not as punishment, but as another form of sensation. Another way to feel alive in a society where everything had become too comfortable, too safe, too predictable. They sought taboos to break, not because they were inherently cruel, but because transgression provided a thrill that normal existence could no longer offer. Forbidden knowledge, forbidden acts. Lines crossed not out of malice, but out of the simple need to feel the boundary snap beneath your feet. And in the warp, something noticed. The Imperium is a reflection. Remember, every thought, every emotion, every conscious act ripples through its surface, and the Aeldari were the most psychically powerful species in the galaxy. Their souls burned bright. Their emotions resonated in the warp like bells ringing in an empty cathedral. When they felt joy, the warp sang with it. When they felt sorrow, the warp wept. And when they began to feel this new thing, this desperate grasping hunger for sensation beyond sensation, pleasure beyond pleasure, experience that could finally make them feel alive again, the warp began to change. A new god was being born. Not quickly, not all at once. The gestation took thousands of years, millennia of Aeldari excess, feeding energy into the warp, building something in the depths of the Imperium that had never existed before. A god of sensation, of pleasure, of pain, of excess in all its forms. A deity that embodied every boundary crossed, every taboo shattered, every desperate attempt to feel something, anything that could pierce through the numbness of existence. The Aeldari seers began to notice. The most powerful psychers among them could feel something growing in the warp. A pressure, a presence, like a storm building on the horizon, still distant but growing larger with each passing year. Some tried to warn their people. They spoke of the danger. They begged the pleasure cults to restrain themselves. They proposed limitations, safeguards, a return to the simpler ways of their ancestors. But try telling a civilization that has pursued pleasure for 10,000 years that they need to stop. Try convincing billions of immortals that the games they've been playing are dangerous, that the boundaries they've been crossing were there for a reason. They didn't listen. They couldn't listen, because stopping would mean confronting the emptiness they'd been running from. It would mean admitting that perfection had made them hollow, that their civilization, for all its beauty and wonder, had become a beautiful corpse, animated only by the desperate pursuit of feeling. So they continued. And the god in the warp continued to grow. And then, in a moment that would shatter the galaxy, she was born. They call it the Fall, as if it were something that happened to them, as if they were innocent victims of cosmic accident rather than the architects of their own damnation. The moment of birth was indescribable. Imagine every act of excess, every moment of pleasure pain, every transgression and sensation, and desperate grasping for meaning that the Aeldari civilization had experienced over thousands of years, condensed into a single instant. The psychic scream of a god being born, Slaanesh, the Dark Prince, she who thirsts, the youngest and perhaps the hungriest of the Chaos gods, born from the collective psychic soul energy of an entire civilization's pursuit of perfection and excess. The birth scream tore through the warp like a knife through silk. And in the material universe, at the heart of the Aeldari Empire, reality simply broke. A wound opened, a tear in space where the warp bled through into the material universe, what would later be called the Eye of Terror, a massive region of space where the laws of physics became suggestions, where time flowed differently, where demons walked freely, and reality itself was subject to the whims of chaos. Every Aeldari within the core worlds died instantly, not just their bodies, their souls, consumed by the newborn god. Billions upon billions of Aeldari, whose psychic potential had been so great, whose souls had burned so bright, devoured in the first moments of Slaanesh's existence. Those further from the epicenter died more slowly. They felt the pull, the hunger, their souls drawn toward the growing tear in reality like water circling a drain. Some tried to flee, some tried to fight, some perhaps simply accepted their fate. In the end, it didn't matter. The fall consumed the heart of the Aeldari Empire in a psychic cataclysm that shook the galaxy. Entire star systems disappeared into the eye. Worlds that had stood for millions of years were torn apart or transformed into demon worlds where reality obeyed no consistent rules. The Aeldari, who had once dominated the galaxy, were reduced to scattered survivors, refugees clinging to the remnants of their former glory. But not all the Aeldari died. Some, through luck or foresight or simple distance from the heart of the Empire, survived. The craft worlds. These were massive ships, each one a world unto itself, that had been built at the height of Aeldari civilization. Some had been launched as colony vessels, others as explorer ships. But in the years before the fall, as the seers grew more insistent in their warnings, many Aeldari fled to these vessels. They severed ties with the core worlds. They sailed into the void, seeking distance from the growing wound in reality. When Slaanesh was born, they were far enough away to survive. The pull was still there. Slaanesh still hungered for their souls. But they were not consumed immediately. They developed technology to protect themselves. Spirit stones, psychic gems that could capture and preserve an Aeldari soul after death, preventing it from being devoured by the chaos god they had accidentally created. The craft worlds became mobile nations, each one carrying tens of thousands of Aeldari, preserving what fragments of their culture they could salvage. They wander the galaxy even now, tens of thousands of years later, proud, diminished, forever hunted by a god that hungers for their souls. Kamara, the Dark City. Deep in the Webway, a group of Aeldari had built a metropolis that existed outside normal spacetime. They were the Corsairs, the Pirates, the Outcasts even before the fall. And when Slaanesh was born, they were insulated by the layers of reality between the Webway and real space. But the city was not untouched. The walls between reality and the warp grew thin. Warp predators found their way in. The Aeldari of Kamara, who would become known as the Drukhari, discovered that they were still subject to Slaanesh's hunger. Their souls were being slowly drained, consumed. So they found a solution. They fed Slaanesh other souls instead of their own. They became raiders, pirates, torturers. They would descend upon real space in screaming raids, capturing mortals and dragging them back to Kamara. There, in the dark arenas and torture chambers, they would extract every possible moment of suffering, every scream, every drop of pain pleasure, and feed it to Slaanesh. A tithe paid in the suffering of others so that their own souls might be spared a little longer. The Drukhari became monsters not because they chose evil, but because it was the only way to survive. The cruelty of Comarach is not sadism for its own sake. It is the desperate economy of a dying people, trading the suffering of others for one more day of existence. The Exodites. Before the fall, some Aeldari had seen the danger and chosen a different path. They abandoned the core worlds entirely. They fled to primitive, untouched worlds at the edge of Aeldari space and did something their civilization had not done in millions of years. They returned to nature. The Exodites live simple lives on feral worlds, bonded with great reptilian beasts, practicing only the most basic psychic arts. They rejected the excess that doomed their species. They chose simplicity over sophistication, survival over sensation. They are few, scattered, often forgotten by the other Aeldari. But they endure, perhaps more successfully than any of their more civilized cousins. Now that we've seen what the warp can do, how it broke during the war in heaven, how it gave birth to Slaanesh, it's time to understand what it actually is. The Imperium, the Warp, the Sea of Souls, the Imperium. It has many names, and none of them fully capture its nature. But let me try. Imagine that reality has two layers. The material universe, planets, stars, space, matter, energy, all the things you can touch and measure, is one layer. But there's another layer beneath it, or above it, or beside it. Direction doesn't really work when describing the warp. This other layer is made of consciousness, of thought and emotion given form. Every sentient being with a soul creates ripples in this realm. When you feel anger, that anger resonates in the warp. When you feel joy, hope, fear, love, all of it echoes there. In a calmer time, before the war in heaven, the warp was relatively tranquil. It reflected consciousness, but it did not yet have its own inhabitants, its own will. But consciousness is never neutral. Strong emotions, repeated across billions of minds, begin to accumulate, to coalesce, to take on forms of their own. This is how the Chaos Gods were born, not as deliberate creations, but as emergent phenomena. Vast, self-aware psychic constructs formed from the accumulated emotions of countless trillions of living beings across millions of years. Khorne, the blood god, born from every act of rage and violence and martial honor, twisted into endless slaughter. Nurgle, the plague father, born from disease and decay and the strange comfort found in accepting entropy. Tzainch, the changer of ways, born from ambition and hope and the desperate need to control an uncertain future. And Slaanesh, the youngest, born from the Aeldari's pursuit of excess and perfection. These are not gods in the traditional sense. They are patterns, massive, self-perpetuating thought forms that have gained something like consciousness. They exist because we exist. They feed on emotion. They grow stronger when mortals feel the emotions that correspond to their nature. And they hunger. The warp is not just a reflection. It can affect the material universe. It can bleed through. Warp storms are regions where the barrier between realities grows thin, where the emotions and chaos of the immaterium spill into normal space. Ships caught in warp storms can be torn apart, twisted, changed. Crews can go mad from exposure to the raw stuff of consciousness made manifest. Demons are fragments of the Chaos Gods, splinters of their vast consciousness given temporary form. They exist primarily in the warp, but when the barrier weakens, They can manifest in reality. They are not alive in any way we understand. They are expressions of pure emotion. A demon of Khorne is rage given form. A demon of Nurgle is decay and acceptance personified. They can be banished, but not truly killed. Because you cannot kill rage, you cannot murder the concept of decay. Destroying a demon's physical form simply sends it back to the warp, where it will eventually reform. Psykers are humans, or members of other species, born with the ability to touch the warp directly, to pull its energies into reality and shape them. A Psyker can throw fire with thought, read minds, see the future, move objects without touching them. But every time a Psyker reaches into the warp, they risk drawing attention. The Chaos Gods notice, the demons notice, and sometimes they reach back. A Psyker who loses control can become a gateway, their body a doorway through which demons pour into reality. This is why the Imperium fears Psykers even as it needs them, why uncontrolled Psykers are hunted and killed, why the black ships roam the galaxy, collecting those born with the gift curse of psychic power. But the warp is also necessary, because it's the only way to travel faster than light. Ships in the 40th millennium don't move through space in the traditional sense. They translate into the warp. They enter the Imperium, where the laws of physics break down, where distance becomes negotiable. A journey that might take centuries at light speed can be accomplished in weeks or months by traveling through the warp. But it's dangerous. The warp has no geography, no consistent paths. It's an ocean of emotion where currents shift based on the psychic state of the galaxy. Warp storms can blow ships off course. Demon attacks can breach the Geller fields, the shields that protect ships from the warp's influence, and slaughter entire crews. And without something to navigate by, ships would be lost forever in that screaming chaos. This is where the Astronomicon comes in. The Astronomicon is a psychic lighthouse, a beacon of incredible power that shines from holy Terra, piercing through the warp itself. Ships can orient themselves by this light. Navigators, humans born with a third eye that can perceive the warp directly, use the Astronomicon to plot courses through the Imperium. Without it, the Imperium would collapse. Worlds would be isolated. Fleets would be lost. The vast empire spanning 1,000,000 worlds would fragment into 1,000,000 separate stories. The Astronomicon is powered by the Emperor himself, or rather, by what remains of him. Seated on the Golden Throne, sustained by life support systems 10,000 years old, his psychic power is channeled and amplified to create the beacon. But it requires constant feeding. The Emperor, even in his broken state, cannot sustain the Astronomicon alone. He needs fuel. Psychic fuel. This is where the black ships come in. The same ships that hunt and collect rogue Psykers don't just do so for safety. They bring those Psykers to Terra, to the Golden Throne. And there, in a process that is part ritual and part psychic sacrifice, the Psykers are consumed. Their life force, their souls, fed into the machinery that sustains the Emperor and powers the Astronomicon. The exact numbers vary depending on which sources you believe. Some say 1,000 souls per day. Others say 10,000. The Imperium keeps these numbers deliberately vague, even from itself. But the scale is always vast, always terrible. Every day, for 10,000 years, human beings with psychic gifts have been sacrificed to keep the light burning. Young Psykers, old Psykers, those who never asked for their power. those who tried to hide it. All of them ground up in the machinery of empire, their deaths measured in navigational accuracy rather than human cost. This is the Imperium's great secret, its necessary atrocity, the price of holding 1,000,000 worlds together, the cost of preventing humanity's complete fragmentation in a hostile galaxy. And most citizens never know. They pray to the Emperor. They sing hymns of his glory. They see the Astronomicon as a miracle. They don't know it runs on screaming souls. One last thing about the warp before we move on. Time. In the material universe, time flows forward. 1 second follows another. Cause precedes effect. The past is fixed, the future uncertain, the present a knife edge between them. In the warp, time is negotiable. A ship might enter the Imperium, travel for what feels like 2 weeks to its crew, and emerge to find that 2 centuries have passed in real space, or 2 days, or no time at all. The relationship between warp time and real time is inconsistent, unpredictable, and sometimes deliberately malicious. There are stories of ships arriving at their destination before they departed, of fleets that emerged from the warp to find their homeworlds destroyed thousands of years in the past, of messages received decades before they were sent. This is why Imperial dating is inherently flawed. The Imperium uses a dating system based on millennia, M30, M31, M42, but these dates are approximations at best. A fleet might leave Terra in M41.9999 and arrive at its destination in M42.01. But for the fleet, only months passed. Meanwhile, the world they left might experience those years in real time. Coordinating events across 1,000,000 worlds when time itself is unreliable is impossible. The Administratum tries. They have vast bureaucracies dedicated to reconciling timelines, to figuring out which events happened in what order. But it's a losing battle. This is the real reason why the timeline of Warhammer 40,000 is deliberately vague. Not because Games Workshop can't keep their continuity straight, but because in-universe, the galaxy itself cannot keep its continuity straight. The records are contradictory because time has become contradictory. An event might be recorded as happening in M41.890 on one world and M41.920 on another, and both records might be correct from their perspective. Chroniclers on Terra might debate for centuries about which version is true, but the answer is that both are, and neither is, because the warp has made linear time a polite fiction that reality occasionally chooses to respect. This is the galaxy we're discussing. One where the past is uncertain, the future unknowable, and the present shifts depending on where you're standing and how recently you've been through the warp. Keep that in mind as we move forward through the timeline. Every date I give you is an approximation. Every "and then this happened" contains an implicit "probably" from certain perspectives in some timelines. So, we've covered 60 million years in about 45 minutes, from the war in heaven that broke the galaxy, through the Aeldari's rise and catastrophic fall, to an understanding of the warp itself. The ocean of souls that makes faster-than-light travel possible and slowly drives everyone who touches it insane. We've seen how the oldest civilizations destroyed themselves through hubris, how the Necrons chose immortality and found only emptiness, how the Aeldari perfected themselves into extinction, how the very fabric of reality was scarred by wars so vast that they birthed gods from suffering. And we've learned that the warp, that realm of thought and emotion, that reflection of consciousness, is not just a backdrop to the story. It is a character in its own right, hungry, patient, growing stronger with every emotion, every continued thought, every moment of consciousness that ripples across its surface. This is the foundation, the bedrock of myth and horror upon which everything else is built. The scars left by the war in heaven have never healed. The gods born from that ancient trauma still hunger. The Necrons still sleep in their tomb worlds, slowly awakening to find a galaxy they no longer recognize. The Aeldari still flee from the god they created, paying in daily suffering for their ancestors' mistakes. And humanity? Humanity hasn't even arrived yet. When we return for Part 2, we'll trace the rise of the species that would eventually claim this broken galaxy as their birthright. We'll watch as primitive humans discover fire, develop agriculture, reach for the stars, and then lose everything in a catastrophe that makes the fall of the Aeldari look like a local tragedy. We'll see the age of technology, when humanity built wonders that would make the Mechanicus weep with envy. And we'll see the age of strife, when those wonders turned to ash, and the species that had reached the stars found itself isolated, fragmented, prey to horrors it had never imagined. We'll meet the figure who would change everything, the Emperor of Mankind, a being whose origins are deliberately mysterious, whose power is undeniable, and whose vision for humanity would shape, or doom, the next 40,000 years. But that's for next time. For now, let this settle. The war in heaven, the birth of the Chaos Gods, the warp as both highway and hell, the Aeldari's fall from grace, the Necrons' long sleep. These are the shadows that hang over everything that follows. Every war in the 42nd millennium is an echo of the war in heaven. Every demon incursion is a reminder that the warp was broken 60 million years ago and has never been repaired. Every craft world sailing through the void carries the memory of an empire that touched perfection and found only oblivion. The galaxy was old and wounded long before humanity's story began. And understanding that wound, that ancient trauma that never healed, is essential to understanding everything that follows. So rest now. Let these images settle in your mind like sediment in dark water. Ancient machines sleeping beneath dead worlds. Eldar souls captured in gems to escape an eternal hunter. Gods made of emotion, hungering in a realm where thought becomes reality. A universe where time itself cannot be trusted, where history is written in contradictions, and where the only certain truth is that suffering is eternal. When you're ready, we'll continue. We'll trace humanity's rise from Terra's cradle. We'll watch as it reaches for greatness, achieves it, loses it, and reaches again with bloodied hands and desperate faith. We'll see how a species with no natural advantages, no psychic gifts, no ancient technology managed to claim a galaxy that was already old when our sun was born. And we'll understand why, in the 42nd millennium, that claim is written in so much blood that it has stained the stars themselves. Thank you for walking with me through deep time, through the epochs when gods were born and civilizations fell, through the moments when reality itself was broken and never properly mended. Sleep well, dream of silent tombs and screaming stars, of perfection pursued until it became poison, of wars so vast that they echo across eternity. And remember, everything we've discussed tonight happened before humanity's story truly began, which means the worst is yet to come. Until Part 2, may you find rest in the spaces between nightmares. May your dreams be free from the whispers of the warp. And may you wake with the knowledge that, for all its horror, this universe's story is also one of survival, of endurance, of consciousness refusing to be extinguished, no matter how dark the galaxy becomes. The Emperor protects, or so they say. Good night. If you're still here, maybe start the next episode. Or just let the quiet take you. And if you've already drifted off, that's all right. Good night, traveler. Sleep well beneath the stars.